Hello, everyone. This video lecture is going to cover PCS procedures for the digestive system. Let's have a look. And Table 14.1 in your text talks about all the root operations. By now, at this point in the course, you'll probably be familiar with them. But some of these things, particularly extirpation, seems to throw people for a loop. So again, you might want to review those in Table 14.1. We'll take a look at that very quickly right now. And again, as always, you can go ahead and look at the appendix for some of these root operations if you're unclear on it. I think most people, when coding PCS procedures, don't really struggle as much with this as some of the other areas. But another thing is that what exactly are the body parts? And we typically tend to focus on esophagus, stomach, duodenum, ileum, cecum, colon, but we also have more. We have such things as cecum, appendix, ascending colon, descending colon, rectum, and the ileocecal valve. These are normally labeled on the procedure notes for the GI system, but it does get into that final level of detail. And again, we just covered this: the small intestine, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, ileocecal valve, lower intestinal tract, large intestine left, right, ascending colon, descending colon. All these things are spelled out. So again, have to read the procedure note very carefully, and that takes us through 4 characters. Moving on to the 5th character. Whoops. We have the peritoneum, and now we're going to get into the 5th. We have the approaches, and this is where sometimes people get a little bit confusing. All these are fair game that are mentioned in Table 14.3 in your text and also the code book. You could have open procedures. You could have percutaneous. You could have percutaneous through an endoscopic approach. You could do something through a natural opening or through a natural opening endoscopic. Or you could use natural artificial opening with a percutaneous endoscopic assistance. Or it could be something that's done externally. Let's take a look at that in Table 14.3. And again, same material that we see here, right? How we find out which is which. We have to know those approaches by reading the procedure note carefully. We also get into devices, right? Sometimes we'll have drainage devices, radioactive elements, extraluminal devices, all these different types of things. And now, again, as we discussed, these are the devices. Sometimes people have an artificial sphincter put in, stimulator lead, feeding devices, other devices, and so on. That takes us through the 6th character. Now we just have the qualifiers. And again, as we know, the qualifier specifies an additional attribute. So this could be whether something was cutaneous, duodenum, zooplastic, allogenic, or what have you. All those are possibilities. But yet we have more. We have more qualifiers. And we'll see some examples of these. We have the ileum, large intestine, cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and so forth. Let's take a look at table 14.5. And again, here you see the ones that we're familiar with, and then you can see in your code book what happens with these. And we'll do some examples of this with the questions that'll appear on the screen. Now we're going to get into the hepatobiliary, right? So this is pancreas, liver, etc. And the root operations in 14.6, we see much of the same ones we see here before. We also have supplement and transplantation, right? Character 4, just like we saw before, is the body part. But note here, the body parts are a little bit different in this table that we'll take a look at. And this is a table 14.7. We'll also see that in your code book. We'll have a quick look at that now. So note the different body parts, gets into a little bit finer level detail. Note that there are also things like the hepatic duct right, hepatic duct left, hepatic duct common, cystic duct, common bile duct, and so on. So really important to get the right code that you read this fourth character, look for this fourth character in the procedure note. It will describe what was done and how it happened. Now we're on to the fifth character, same types of approaches we've seen before. And these are mentioned in table 14.8 in your text, also in your code book. Could be open, percutaneous, and so on. Character 6 will identify the device if it's used in a procedure. We don't always think of these things, these procedures on the hepatobiliary system as having devices, but if you think about it more, it makes sense. And these are things like drainage devices, radioactive elements, monitoring, and so on. And then finally, the seventh character. The seventh character is a qualifier. So these are things that we've seen before, the zooplastic and so on, but also gets into some of the same terms we saw in body parts, as you can see here. And how we find those is by carefully reading the procedure note. Another thing to think about is some GI digestive procedures can be done either through a laparoscopic endoscopic approach or open. And how we know that is by reading the procedure note. When we see the term repair, again, procedure could be done either laparoscopically or through an incision. And what is the herniopathy? It's basically, it's a repair. And when we see synthetic substitute, that's going to clue us in that it's the root operation of supplement. So in other words, we're reinforcing something. And then we could also code it as a repair, right? If we're not bringing in something to supplement it. So the bottom line is some of these procedures may have more than one root operation. We don't just automatically assume that it's going to be a repair just because it ends in HAPHY. We have to actually read the note and determine whether we're using something, synthetic substitute, Gore-Tex graft, what have you, as opposed to repairing it and stitching things together. If mesh is used, it is a synthetic substitute, right? So if it's a synthetic substitute, then we're going to be looking at root operation. When sutures are used, it's a repair. So hopefully you can keep those two things in mind. So when we have a herniopathy and mesh is used, root operation will be supplement. When we're using sutures, besides the ones that close the initial incision, the root operation is going to be a repair. And we'll start by going to table 0YU and then go from there. Sometimes we'll do closed endoscopic biopsies or endoscopic decisions. With biopsies, of course, we're going to take some tissue and send it to pathology where it'll be prepped and read, and then we'll have an idea of what's going on. A biopsy could either be a drainage or an excision, right? And how we know which to use depends on what is written in the procedure note. And if you look at table 14.12 from table 0DB that we're going to go to in a minute, you'll see an example of this. And again, all these will be coming from the same table, right? So we have the first three characters right out of the gate, 0DB, it's an excision. Now we get into the body part that takes us through the fourth character. And then we have to look to see what was the approach, the device, and the qualifier. We can also have stoma procedures. Stomas are the artificial openings between two cavities or channels. And basically, it allows the contents of the GI tract to move from the interior to outside the body through an opening in the skin instead of through the anus. This could be an ileostomy, where somebody has a colectomy and then they direct the ileum to an opening in the skin, or it could be a colostomy, where it's down and part of the colon is still intact. And again, how do we code this? This is where your terminology comes in. Gastrostomies involve an incision into the stomach to permit a synthetic feeding tube, very common procedure. Colostomy, basically an artificial opening in the colon. Ileostomy is a creation of an artificial opening in the ileum. Sometimes we will do a loop ileostomy where we basically are repurposing a segment of the small intestine to the exterior of the body. And again, how you'll know that is by carefully reading the procedure note. Bypass is basically altering the route of passage from the contents of a tubular body part. And the root operation, of course, is bypass. And the fourth character is going to be the body part where the ostomy started. And then the seventh character is going to give us where the passage route is directed. And then in between, we'll have the approach. We'll have the sixth character, which will tell us whether we're putting something that's synthetic or a tissue substitute. One thing to keep in mind, we talked about how if we see some sort of synthetic substitute, that shows us that it's a supplement. That's not the case here because the root operation, again, is the bypass. We're altering the root passage of the contents of a tubular part. We're not repairing something. So just be sure you keep that in mind as you go through these. An intestinal resection, a colectomy, resections, is basically removing a portion of the colon. We sometimes see these in cancer operations and what have you. And these could be done either through an incision, low anterior resection type of thing, or it could be done through a scope. The root operation is an excision because we're removing a portion of a body part, or if we're doing a total colectomy, it's a resection because we're removing the entire colon. And these are illustrated in table 14.13 in your text. And again, excision, we know it's the medical surgical section. It's on the GI system. An excision, cutting out or off a portion of a body part, that's different than the resection, which is cutting out or off the whole body part. Something that we see from time to time with procedures like a low anterior resection of the colon is the surgical formation of a channel, right? We do an anastomosis. The anastomosis, in other words, the sewing together of the two different sections of the colon when we take out the diseased part of it, is the anastomosis is not coded separately. And that's because of the guideline that you can see that the procedural steps necessary to reach an operative site or to close it, including anastomosis, are not coded separately. And that's all I have for you. Please stop by office hours or reach out if you have any questions about this material. Thank you so much. We'll see you online. Bye now.